All right, so welcome everyone for Cloud Computing and Big Data, our lecture 6 on deep learning driven by big data. So we learned in the first initial part of the lecture that a normal linear perceptron is not enough if we want to go to really sophisticated decision boundaries. We have seen the linear learning model is always restricted to a linear, that's what the name suggests, decision model. So we add non-linearities to the model and we combine them, basically more neurons, more of these little perceptrons, in order to make the case that we just combine these different decision boundaries. And by combining those and by having many different neurons, we come to something called multi-layer perceptron or artificial neural nets, as they're also called. Here and there, of course, there are lots of tunings that we have seen. So basically, you can vary the number of neurons. We had just 10 for our multi-layer output perceptron. Basically, artificial neural networks could maybe have in the hidden layer 128, just to say a number. And in the second hidden layer, basically another 128. But these numbers, nobody giving you. That's something what you have to basically play around, work around, and see what basically would do the job by iteratively going then through this optimization technique, like SGD is an example. Of course, today we use also more advanced techniques like ADAM or other optimizers, but essentially they all have the same key goal, minimizing the loss function, the error that we basically have by taking derivatives and so on and doing the optimization. Now, doing this in an artificial neural network is essentially impossible because you're missing the signal. And that is something what I left out in the first part. That is basically impossible. Why I say impossible, there's of course a trick to it. You remember that when you have a hidden layer, then you don't have the guiding output to calculate the error. Right, so you have to go to the end of the network to have then the error. So you could not correct the hidden neurons. It's something I alluded to called the chain rule. Have you heard from the chain rule by chance in another course? Right, so that's why it's called back propagation. It back propagates the error back through the different layers through a mechanism called the chain rule. But this would be another lecture, and we skip that and refer to other courses which are really teaching this. I go into this in lecture 7 just a bit to get the point. But basically this back propagation that we have seen with the forward and backward pass to learn and train is a bit more loaded than just having, let's say, a couple of lines here. Hence, that's something what you have to implement while we're talking in the break, right? It's a chain rule in going through different layers if you do different layers. And you have to do it by yourself, taking all the derivatives and so on. Anyway, so we have seen also we had a yardstick of 95%, which was better than the multi-output perceptron with 91%. Now the question machine learning is always can we go better, right? 95% is already quite a good example if you want. But as we also know, in Netflix, there was one surprise with just 1 or 2% better, basically in performance. Then you basically are the man and get a big check from Netflix, because for those companies, 1% or 2% means a lot of business, means a lot of money, right? So hence in machine learning, every little percent counts. Now, some things in the assignment 1, you have realized that through numerical instability of these optimizers, basically very similar are often the reported measures. So, and if it's just in the basically 0, 0.1, 0, 0.2 differences, these are not big steps in machine learning, largely because SGD is not really deterministic. It depends how you jump. That's why many of you have probably hopefully observed that. We will debrief that in one point in time on Thursdays. Where we basically have then very similar, basically accuracy reported, essentially alluding to the fact that this is not really an advancement, it's rather the instability of the approach. But deep learning now is an interesting topic, thinking about what else we can do to improve now again. And as I said earlier, it was initially considered as a flux, and actually the paper we just had in the break, I just put here as an example. So we see that even liquid gas and so on can actually now generalize well out of sample. So meaning that you have water modeled in specific ways and structures, and basically it has never seen it and can flow correctly. That's what we want from AI, right? We want to predict future flows, right? What traditionally can be just done in physics. It is a very highly physics-driven field, CFD, computational fluid dynamics. I teach in HPC, but AI can now basically do very similar things. And for a fraction of the cost of the computation, which of course is interesting for us, thinking always about the computing. But it has now resulted everywhere in breakthroughs and successes that deep learning is the modus operandi per se for every learning problem these days. from image recognition up to sequence analysis. We have also seen gaming, so reinforcement structures with AlphaGo. They actually now used for protein prediction in sciences also, just to apply basically all different fields. And as soon as you go deep, there's of course lots of power in the network to learn, as we have seen already by just deepening the neural network a little bit, we came with this 4% more. Now the price you have to do, you know, from one of my earlier, let's say, sneak previews of deep learning is two things really. You have to have data. If you have deep learning, you will realize you have lots of parameters, lots of things to steer, lots of things to learn. And you cannot do this if you just have small data sets, right? So if you're just talking about a couple of samples, you're better off with SVMs, random forest, traditional learners. They still have their relevance. And the second problem or challenge in deep learning is, of course, a computational footprint. So if you go with traditional learning models, they usually can be maybe still not done in Scikit. When you go to big learning problems, and it's probably already tough to do this. But as soon as you really go to medium deep learning networks or ResNet 50 residual networks, which are cutting edge in image recognition, you have to pay the price of doing computing basically in a cloud on a HPC machine, at least using one GPU. You remember one of the gentlemen who were using here, one of the deep learning networks who came in, he actually had, I think, 36 hours of the laptop run on the GPU, right? It's incredible. But of course, that's just the start and was a very tiny network that he used. Now, if you do a professional cutting edge network, you need to have lots of computing capacities. In research, we have 128 GPUs we use in parallel, for instance, together in order to train these models. Of course, on the other hand of the scale, you gain massively on accuracy in almost all problems, you know, if you have data enough, right? If you don't swim in data, there are many other approaches, but deep learning is not what I can recommend you. And for this, you see also, just as a side remark, one of the biggest awards you can have in computer science is the Turing Award, and basically the founding fathers there, Geoffrey Hinton, Yossef Bengio, and then basically LeCun, they all got the Turing Award essentially for deep learning, because now it has proven to be the cutting edge AI technology. And because it needs so much computing, is something which is intertwined with high performance computing, intertwined with cloud computing, because you cannot do cutting edge deep learning without them. Or you spend maybe a week on letting your laptop on one GPU running until it's overheated. But that's not what we want to do. Therefore, they use cloud computing. More on that, of course, and also in lecture 7. So here I want to convey rather the message, what is deep learning? In one of the earlier lectures, I also presented to you. Here we don't talk about deep learning just by adding more layers now. We have seen in the beginning of the first part here, we said we add 2 hidden layers. Now, what's not the idea of deep learning is just to repeat that and say, now we have 128 layers with the same concepts and putting it very deep. The key idea in itself is there, but still, we also talk about so-called smart layers we add. It's not just this kind of stupid neuron that we have seen before that we add is a non-linearity, and then multiply by weights, simple linearity, multiply by weights, and go through. Here we're talking about specific functionality I will come to now in the second part, which makes it so successful. And you see there's a little bit what we just discussed here with the digit recognition, right? To really understand what we have done more in a view perspective. The first one was a normal perceptron. Now you see by adding these hidden layers, all of these are connected to everyone else. And then the softmax at the end gives us a probability of the number, essentially which class it would be, right? So this is a multi-layer perceptron, or basically the artificial neural network that we discussed with 2 hidden layers and then output, which is also fully connected. Everything is fully connected. And this will be also a difference to deep learning that I will convey today and tomorrow, talking about weight sharing. And this is the success that you see now with convolutional neural networks. You see immediately a complete other architecture, right? So it's not anymore of just connecting everything with everyone, just arbitrary. Here we think about so-called feature maps. This detect local features in the data of the image. And this will be a key paradigm. Secondly, you observe we're not in one linear world anymore. It's not 1D, we are still in 2D, and we can go 3D, by the way. So this is something where in order to do this image recognition And the spiking neural networks are part of research, so I think I spare you this one. But essentially, this is now the idea that differentiates the neural networks that we have seen from the deep neural networks, essentially by this top element there on the slide. What we did in neural networks were still a 1D input, long vector. And if you want to do feature engineering work on this, like symmetry of digits, we could encode that in the data and then put it into the neural network. So this is normal machine learning, feature engineering, and then you do modeling. So what essentially deep learning now does is it does so-called feature learning. So the features basically are out of our control, more or less. We just put the data in and the features are learned automatically by the deep learning. And the interesting thing is, of course, that these learning machines are smarter than we are. So they find interesting ways of learning from data we never would consider, right? So one interesting example would be from an image, the very complicated images, where everybody was thought why basically it has learned it, but it learned the folder hierarchy, which was basically imprinted in all the images, right? But nobody would think about that this network is so smart enough doing it on its own. It learned basically just the folder hierarchy, and by that could predict perfectly right. And while everybody was just, even the experts thinking about the images. So this is something where deep learning is really interesting. And again, we have a very complicated setup of how you construct these now. So this is not anymore another dense layer, another dense layer, another dense layer, done. So here we're really thinking about different architectures, how much feature maps you want to develop, how many channels you have in an image. And then you have certain pooling expression. All the goal would be to extract the certain features in the data in an automated way. And then, which is interesting enough, the same remains like we have seen in neural networks before. The last bits, at least in image classifications, are again a fully connected network with a softmax to do the probabilities of the digits. So you see essentially what the difference is really this feature learning. And of course, you can imagine, you see here already very nice bad examples, so to speak, here in this area. Of course, still, even if you were to think, okay, neural networks, are they doing now the 100%? Can they do the 100%? You immediately could see it's probably not possible, right? Because even we humans would have major difficulties in exploring what numbers those are. So, and this is, of course, a machine learning problem, usually meaning there's always noise in the data is something we really can't learn. That's why usually machine learning is never 100%. But at least we can go towards this direction and see if we can improve. And an interesting thing that I will also allude to next time when we have lecture 7, it can do partial things very right. While in former algorithms, this would be a problem to have just partial faces, right? And to have then a face recognition. Through the kind of feature extraction, which is independent of the location in an image, you can have also face detection just on parts of the features or parts of the, basically, of the body done. So what are the basic principles now? How that operates is essentially that you create a certain architecture. In the beginning, we take this, let's say, as just a trivial example, and go in here and there some operation examples by thinking about, again, this spatial structure, right? If you remember, in neural networks, we vectorized. In multi-layer perceptrons, we vectorized always 1D and putting the signal in 1D again and again through the network. So that's not what we do here. We preserve the spatial locality of the pixels, right, which are given by the input neurons, so-called local receptive fields. And if you compare to biology, that's exactly why we humans are so good in it. We do exactly the same thing. We don't look at the whole cow. We look at the part of the cow locally and see, aha, there's this image pattern, which we now recognize from the part of the cow. So it must be a cow. We don't even need the whole image, basically. So, and because we detect this part of the cow, which has this remarkable image pattern, of course, with the different colors, we can then identify it. No matter if the other cow actually has a completely different pattern, but it's on another location, it doesn't matter. So these are the kind of principles, what was also a little bit in the video. Of course, we try to more map what we do as human brain, basically, into some form of coding. Now, again, the other thing, of course, 5x5 local connectivity might be no limited. Of course, this is now the weights that you have to compute. So depending on your local connectivity, you have more compute or less. And this is a little bit now the limits. If you think about, you have very high resolution images of 4,000 by 4,000 pixels, and you want to really stride over them. Using this local receptive field, you have lots of different weights. It would basically blast everything. So that's why these days we still have to, let's say, crunch and shaping the images down to make the computing, let's say, digestible. But if we do so, we still have very high accuracy rates in detecting things. So by preserving this local field or local basically perceptive field, we just go basically step by step over the image, right? The input image step by step, and generating what we called a feature map or a connected, convoluted or convolve feature. There are different wordings around it. Essentially is that you specify a certain filter. You see that a little bit here in this animation quite nicely of enforcing the signal or weakening it. And by this, you can compute always by going over step by step the next value that is actually in these different cells. So in one way, you downsample and strengthen the signal or weaken those for certain features. I come to this also in lecture 7 because it's one of the key principles now how that works. But here I want to convey firstly the message that essentially you keep the local areas, right? And by this, the detection is of course much more simpler of features than in the 1D case where you lose a lot of these features. And by doing so iteratively now, basically going through all the data set, you would basically end up in lots of different, let's say, long deep learning networks, which needs lots of computing. So there's another concept called pooling and downsampling, so to speak, to really make it digestible, because otherwise you would have lots of different convolutional kernels to compute, and this would be massively expensive in terms of computing. You see also sometimes it doesn't fit. There's a so-called padding we have to do sometimes when you specify a filter that doesn't just match, and the stride just doesn't match. So stride means how accurate you go through it. Let's say stride 1 means really literally every pixel, but you can have also 2, then basically go every second pixel. That's another hyperparameter really that you have to tune and that you can actually decide on. And when you do this basically over iteratively, you maybe come to an element which is essentially here, depending on your strides or on your image sizes, you maybe have something when the input size kernel or the filter that you apply doesn't match the data, what we call then padding. But you see also here as a good example, just why this works so nicely. This is here, of course, red, green, blue. So if you think about a color image, we can do 3D. And we cannot 3D in a sense of 3D. We can 3D in a sense of making out of this different features, which we call feature maps, which is another, let's say, parameter or actually an element in the architecture you can now steer in order to detect the car or basically our digits. You now basically have to decide how many of those layers you want. As I said earlier, there's a convolution operation with this filter going over the data as we see here, actually contributing to this weights. There's a specific area which I will tell on Thursday on the next lecture called weight sharing. That's why you don't see a fully connected mesh here anymore. We talk about that the same weights are actually going through in order to detect the features. It's not completely obvious to you, but it takes more slides to get there. So we cannot put all in this lecture. But essentially saying that by pulling this weight metrics over and learning by strengthening and weakening the signal with a filter, you carve out these features. Admittedly, in the beginning, it's like very high level features, but you break it down to edges, corners, every more. I have a visualization on this in a minute. And then you decide of how many convolutional and nonlinear activations. You see here, ReLU is still there. So the principle of our neurons that we have seen, with 128 neurons is still there. It's still basically a bit shown here. But now, essentially, we put it again and again through this convolution operation. And what I said also, there's a so-called pooling, which could be average pooling, max pooling. Max pooling is often used to, again, think the strongest, fittest, let's say, signal will survive. That's why you take the maximum, which is essentially here. By doing so, you subsample automatically the data and shrink a little bit, essentially, the output, right? And think about that these are all weights that need to be computed, still using the back propagation, back and forth of error and taking the derivative with, it would be taking a lot of compute power. Still, even with this concept of preserving the local perceptivity and, you know, basically the view, the things on the top will be probably not really learnable, right? You see that? It's very hard to carve out maybe features to explain what these would be, or they will be wrongly detected. Still also, no matter how deep you go in this feature learning, this convolution, ReLU pooling, you can do 10 times, 5 times, depends on the application. The funny thing, again, as I told you in the end, we flatten the whole thing. So one vector again, and then put a fully connected network we know already from the multi-layer perceptron, right? Again, for 10 classes in our case, with the digits, where the pooling is, of course, a bit different here. Here we would have it multiple times. Here we have just essentially input 3 features, RGB as an example, and then basically you do the max pooling or something to get smaller, and then the flatten to do the, you know, decision on probabilities with the softmax and fully connected. This will be always remaining, right? If you do classification, they're very advanced topics that then take the weights and take it to transfer learning, which is something which we don't do here in the course, but we're cutting edge research right now. I think in a way that's also all I wanted to leave you on the table for this particular slide. Again, if you don't understand the whole concept yet, we come back to this again and again, but I brought you also a visualization to show you a little bit how that works. Just think about. So a little bit what I had here in theory, you can see here now on this. I tried to make it bigger this time. I don't know if it works with the visualization. But let's say we have here the 8. You basically see a very strong signal, and we have the input image here, and connecting always to, let's say, the different ones that you have on these different feature maps, right? But this is now the important difference. You don't have everyone with everyone in the next layer. You have the so-called feature maps and this weight sharing. So this is basically the same weights are shared in order to detect this 8, this 8, and this 8. And this is basically learned over the data set, right? Because everybody writes the 8 completely differently. But this is a synthesis of going, let's say, through it and defining that I want to have 6 feature maps on that. Nobody tells you this, right? So this is something what you could have 2, you can have 20 if you can afford it, but everything needs to be computed. So in this sense, it's also something for hyperparameter tuning where you have to think about what is the computation capacity I have. Of course, many different feature maps might be nice, but here you could think one indicator is that symmetry is very strong in digits, and they're 10. So you take half of the feature maps, and maybe the 1 and so on is different. You take 6. So it gives you a gut feeling of the data by understanding this, right? In previous times, you would maybe have done feature extraction and would have the artificial neural network put in this is different features. But through iterative learning and then basically coming back to the next layer, right? There's a next convolution operation coming up here. Here we see the pooling effect that is coming. So we downsample the image. Still, the features are still relatively understandable. And everywhere here was this filter going over, right? And learning from the data and go by all this data set that we have, strengthening or enforcing the signal and coming to a rough understanding how people were relatively right 8s. Then the next layer is even interesting because it detects parts of the features, right? So rounds and edges, corners. It's really hard to visualize this, but of course now these things are detected not only in the 8, they are detected maybe in the 3. That's why a little bit, it's very hard to see it, but you see here that the 6, so here are the flattening, if you remember, and the dense layer, where I said, here's really everybody connected with everyone. This is a flatten in one very long vector. To put it now to the output probability of the softmax, and you see here the 6 is gray. It's maybe here in class hard to see, but of course, why is the 6 gray and also potentially a solution? Because 6 and 8 are very much overlapping, right? So the same features which are detected here and make it strong are basically also partly in an 8. So that's why we talk about this output probabilities, that to some certain extent it could be a 6. But of course here the signal, as in the way of the winner takes it all, is an 8. But still we see also here in the details that actually in some areas it could be also a 6. And then you can go on and maybe make a 7. Could also maybe, let me do a 7 that looks a little bit like a 1. And then, you know, you see here the 1 hopefully a little bit more, but we clearly know it's a 7, right? But this is meaning that here the 7 looks pretty obvious to us, but it actually has features of how people write a 1 here. And the feature maps for that are actually activated and will contribute to the output probability of being also a 1 here. And that's how essentially this works with the convolutional network over time, and why it's so different. It preserves the spatial connectivity in the different areas. Sorry, please, I don't hear. Yes, so all of that is essentially created. Second, yeah. So the question is here in the class, sorry, that if we would basically switch and basically can define how many hidden layers there are. And the answer is basically it's completely in your hand as a user, how many of those you do. Usually would always have the structure, however, convolution, pooling, convolution, nonlinearity, and then pooling. And then you have the same block again and again. But there's no one telling you this. There's some, let's say, community standards like AlexNet that have been very good in image recognition that you might like to copy and then modify, or residual networks. But essentially, this is, yeah, a parameter you have to steer. How many neurons you put in the layers? How big should the feature map be? It's all application problems. And that's why the research right now is basically going into this direction. What are the very good architectures and topologies for all sorts of different problems? We have another question in class. To the online audience too, sorry for that. Just shortly, the online audience, the question was the dimensions. You see here, of course, the dimensions reflect on the one hand, really the input data set. Here's a very good example. Every image or one way of actually encoding images of course, is RGB, as you know, which is then here reflected in this, and the strength that it has in these channels for these different RGB signals. Nothing else that we have seen with the numbers, right? From gray and from white. That's the same thing, the signal strength. And when I put now a filter over it, that basically would like having a specific set of weights. You do a weight sharing, which I will include a little bit in lecture 7, a bit more in the convolution, and then are able to detect certain, let's say, numbers in this, and you will strengthen it by applying the filter, as we have seen in the one example with 0 or 1. The 1 stay alive, or sometimes in some specific positions, I will basically carve it out. That's why there's sometimes a sharpening effect here, because the strong signal of the 1 will be, basically coming through, and sometimes, it will be just completely disappearing with 0 and 1s. But of course, there are different ways of how these features are detected and how people write it. Good question also, but let us just, here conclude the lecture just with an outlook what you will do in the assignment. Of course, we want to play around with ourselves to get our hands dirty a bit. You see here, and the scripts will be provided to you. It's more like, again, playing around with the parameters that we see here. So the rectified linear units, you see the convolutional 2D filters we discussed. There's always convolution, the activation function, here the rectified linear unit, and then the max pooling. And then here in the end, you have this kind of idea of flattening it to a fully connected network. Again, the non-linear activation functions, and then putting the softmax for the different classes, right? And however, what we also see is the bombastic improvement of parameters, right? So we have 1.2 million parameters now, right? We started with 7,000 at the beginning of the lectures. Now we have to train 1.2 million parameters. So you can imagine this requires a cloud or HPC or GPUs, because otherwise it will be extremely slow. And you will observe this in the assignment, because you will have to execute it on CPUs and on GPUs, and you will observe the difference significantly. And the rest is things APOS, similar like neural networks before, how many data, the batch size, and so on. Here I put an optimizer atom just to give you an example. It's a SGD on steroids if you want. Validation we will discuss in lecture 7 with a validation split again that you already know from assignment 1. And I think that's almost it. You see, just what we wanted to achieve is something better. We have 99.36% now in this by using deep learning over 20 EPOS. Maybe you can get better if you in the assignment do more EPOS. We don't know, but you also know why we cannot achieve really 100% is probably because these here, which will never be learned from a machine learning entity. Right, so that's all basically. I have here one video for you, but those that have next classes, please go. It's on the recording here, just will play it. Otherwise, it is nice to look at it for understanding overfitting again. That's why I put it. And we see us on Thursday. Of course, you're also welcome to stay if you have time.
Dear fellow scholars, this is 2-minute papers with Károly Zsolnai Fehér. In machine learning, we often encounter classification problems where we have to decide whether an image depicts a dog or a cat. We'll have an intuitive but simplified example where we imagine that the red dots represent dogs and the green ones are the cats. We first start learning on a training set, which means that we get a bunch of images that are points on this plane, and from these points we try to paint the parts of the plane red and green. This way we can specify which regions correspond to the concept of dogs and cats. And after that, we'll get new points that we don't know anything about, and we'll ask the algorithm, for instance a neural network, to classify these unknown images so it tells us whether it thinks that it is a dog or a cat. This is what we call a test set. We have had lots of fun with neural networks and deep learning in previous 2-minute papers episodes. I've put some links in the description box, check them out. In this example, it is reasonably easy to tell that the reds roughly correspond to the left and greens to the right. However, if we just jumped on the deep learning hype train and don't know much about neural networks, we may get extremely poor results like this. What we see here is the problem of overfitting. Overfitting means that our beloved neural network does not learn the concept of dogs or cats, it just tries to adapt as much as possible to the training set. As an intuition, think of poorly made real-life exams. We have a textbook where we can practice with exercises, so this textbook is our training set. Our test set is the exam. The goal is to learn from the textbook and obtain knowledge that proves to be useful at the exam. Overfitting means that we simply memorize parts of the textbook instead of obtaining real knowledge. If you're on page 5 and you see a bus, then the right answer is B. Memorizing patterns like this is not real learning. The worst case is if the exam questions are also from the textbook, because you can get a great grade just by overfitting. So this kind of overfitting has been a big looming problem in many education systems. Now the question is, which kind of neural network do we want? Something that works like a lazy student, or one that can learn many complicated concepts? If we are aiming for the latter, we have to combat overfitting, which is the bane of so many machine learning techniques. Now, there's several ways of doing that, but today we're going to talk about one possible solution by the name L1 and L2 regularization. The intuition of our problem is that the deeper and bigger neural networks we train, the more potent they are, but at the same time, they get more prone to overfitting. The smarter the student is, the more patterns he can memorize. One solution is to hurl a smaller neural network at the problem. If this smaller version is powerful enough to take on the problem, we're good. A student who cannot afford to memorize all the examples is forced to learn the actual underlying concepts. However, it is very possible that this smaller neural network is not powerful enough to solve the problem, so we need to use a bigger one. But bigger network, more overfitting. Damn, so what do we do? And here is where L1 and L2 regularization comes to save the day. It is a tool to favor simpler models instead of complicated ones. The idea is that the simpler the model is, the better it transfers the textbook knowledge to the exam, and that's exactly what we're looking for. Here you see images of the same network with different regularization strengths. The first one barely helps anything, and as you can see, overfitting is still rampant. With a stronger L2 regularization, you see that the model is simplified substantially and is likely to perform better on the exam. However, if we add more regularization, it might be that we simplify the model too much, and it is almost the same as a smaller neural network that is not powerful enough to grasp the underlying concepts of the exam. Keep your neural network as simple as possible, but not simpler. One has to find the right balance, which is an art by itself, and it shows that training deep neural networks takes a bit of expertise. It is more than just a plug-and-play tool that solves every problem by magic. If you want to play with the neural networks you've seen in this video, just click on the link in the description box. I hope you'll have at least as much fun with it as I had. Thanks for watching and for your generous support, and I'll see you next time.
All right. 1 second. I think that's all for today, everyone. Thank you very much for joining today, and we see us on Thursday with Lecture 7. Until then.